New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring ghost hunting. My guest is Loyd Auerbach, who has his master's degree in parapsychology from John F. Kennedy University. He is on the board of directors of the Rhine Research Center in Durham, North Carolina, where he teaches online courses in parapsychology. He is also past president of the Psychic Entertainers Association, and like me, he is a past president of the California Society for Psychical Studies. He is also the director of the Office of Paranormal Investigations and is the author of some 9 books, including Mind Over Matter, ESP, Hauntings, and Poltergeists, a parapsychologist's handbook, Reincarnation, Channeling and Possession, Psychic Dreaming, a paranormal casebook, Ghost Hunting in the New Millennium, and Ghost Hunting, How to Investigate the Paranormal. Also co-authored with Ed May, Joe McMoneagle, and Victor Rubel, ESP Wars, East and West. Once again, this is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Loyd. It's a pleasure to be with you. We've known each other a very long time, and it's been a long time since we've been together in the studio, so I'm delighted to be with you and to talk about ghost hunting, which I know is one of your passions.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's great to see you and to be with you on the show.
So let's talk about ghost hunting. I've been fascinated lately in noticing that there are, I think maybe 20 or 30 groups of individuals, each of which has thousands of individuals on Facebook dedicated to what they call the paranormal, which in almost every case means ghost hunting. It's become, in the last 20 or 30 years, I think of it as sort of a booming new industry.
Well, actually what's interesting is one of my students for the Rhine Center a couple of years ago as a project went online and found over 3,000 ghost hunting groups in the United States alone with active websites. So we're talking thousands of people. And you're right, actually, it's been very active, especially since around the mid-1990s, but more so with a big hike in the early 2000s.
Well, what do you account for this sudden growth?
It really boils down to television, inspiring people to do it. And in many respects, it happened in the mid-90s because TV shows like Sightings were showing myself, Terry Gaynor, and a few other folks walking in with some environmental sensors. And these were, for the first time, relatively inexpensive. So producers started looking at what they could show on TV, even if it's not actually accurately using the equipment.
So I guess the idea is that a lot of these people take it up as a hobby and in the hope that they will get on television.
The number of people who I've run into who are ghost hunters who say, we're making a TV pilot, I can't even count anymore. It's just absolutely absurd because almost none of them actually ever get on TV or do anything.
Well, you're in a unique position as a member of the scientific parapsychology community, but also a ghost hunter yourself, a practicing mentalist and magician yourself. You sort of bridge both the popular world and the scientific world.
One of the things that I really intended to do getting into the field after grad school, and even with my first job at the American Society for Psychical Research, was to do that, was to really bridge the scientific world, hopefully bridge the scientific world of parapsychology and the popular culture. And I've been successful in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, I've been overshadowed by these paranormal TV shows, as have most of our colleagues in the last probably 15 years. And it's a shame, but we still are able to attract people because we can educate them through the media.
We have listeners, or viewers, I should say, for the New Thinking Aloud channel who call themselves ghost hunters and are eager to learn more about what professional psychical researchers and parapsychologists do in these situations.
That's actually great. I've often felt that I've been beating my head against a brick wall in talking to many ghost hunter groups. First of all, I've gone to a few conventions, to ghost hunter conferences. I don't get to go to too many because most of them happen on the East Coast, and of course they don't want to fly the actual experts anywhere. They spend all their money on the TV paranormal celebrities because they're almost fan fests in some respects. Mm-hmm. But what I find is there's a small percentage of people who actually are interested in hearing what we have been doing over the last 130 years, I mean, since the founding of the Society for Psychical Research. But it's a very small percentage. Most of them take everything they see as on TV as real. So when I say we don't investigate in the dark, they look at me like I'm crazy.
Yeah, how else are you supposed to find a ghost if you don't go in the dark?
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense when the ghost only appears to the family at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you know. It's really, I have to sit there and explain to them about patterns and things, but this is very true. In two instances, at 2 different conferences, I had someone after I spoke walk up to me and say, "Why should I listen to you? You don't have a TV show."
Well, there you have it. But on the one hand, I suppose people in the field of psychical research in particular, actual case investigators get annoyed by all of these amateurs who are not only generating most of the publicity, but also giving the public maybe a misimpression about what parapsychology and psychical research is all about.
Well, on the plus side, they don't ever use the word parapsychology, and rarely do they even know the phrase psychical research. So that's a good thing. They don't really get confused with us. But the downside really is these shows and these investigators, supposed investigators, are causing a popular folklore to have developed, which influences the way people perceive or assess their experiences. So people often are more afraid than back in the day when you were doing some field work and I've been doing field work for years. They immediately go to whatever the TV show is that they've seen. So they might go to demon immediately, or they might go to, the thing's going to hurt me, when in fact there's nothing actually happening that would even indicate that.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've investigated, I'm going to say, countless cases.
Yeah, I have not. Yes, that's true.
I mean, probably more than you can count at the moment.
It is true, yeah.
And I think one of the important features of almost all of these cases, you're dealing with individuals who are troubled. That's
the general thrust. I'd say that majority of those cases, people are calling for help. So even if the case turns out not to be paranormal or psychic at all, they're still calling for help. They have no understanding of what's actually happening. But there is a small percentage. I will say I get a small percentage of people who are curious. They have something going on in their house. They're not afraid. They're really curious. And those are some of the best cases. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we have a small number of public places that we've got a relationship with to go back in and out. But most people are either terrified or at the very least annoyed. I've had some very annoyed people call me about their ghost sometimes.
Well, the point being that I would think one of the very first prerequisites to become involved in cases like this is you need a certain amount of psychological sensitivity and sophistication.
I think that it's important to have some understanding of psychology. I certainly don't have a huge psychology background. I have some. But maybe my experience as a bartender helped me also many years ago. It is important to learn how to read people, to assess what's going on from a personal perspective right up front. And part of what I teach, I'm actually teaching in the middle of teaching an advanced investigations course for the Rhine Research Center. And I've taught some field investigation courses as well. And one of the things I teach my students is that it's always better to have a case with more than one witness, because it's unlikely that both will be psychologically disturbed. It's important to know when people start talking about what's happening that it fits in with what we know about how people experience these things, and it doesn't go off into some wild directions. And it's also important that things are current. I see the ghost hunters going out on cases that somebody will tell them they had a ghost in their house or had an experience 2 years ago, and suddenly they're descending on that house looking for the ghost who's probably not even there, if there was one to begin with.
Even the phrase ghost, I don't think the word ghost, it's not part of the vocabulary, to my knowledge, of professional parapsychologists. Maybe psychical researchers use the term. How do you use that word yourself?
So, for me, my preference is the word apparition when we are talking about consciousness that survives the death of the body and is still capable of interaction. For most people, that idea of something, whether it's consciousness or spirit or whatever you want to call it after death, would be a ghost. Mm-hmm. Not all cultures would use that term the same way. For some cultures, ghost also represents any repetitive image that they might see from the past, which is less conscious and more environmental in some respects. So I tend to use it interchangeably with apparition when I'm talking to the general public, because they know the word ghost. When I work with mediums, because I work quite a bit with mediums through the Forever Family Foundation and just in my own investigations, many mediums talk about using the word spirit when they refer to a spirit that's on the other side projecting back, and they use the word ghost for those people who have not moved to the other side. So it still fits for popular parlance, but you're right. And within parapsychology and psychical research, apparition is what we use.
Well, boy, you have raised a dozen questions in my mind with this last comment. So let's try and break it down a little bit. First of all, I suppose I'm hesitant to equate apparition and ghost because there's so much literature concerning apparitions of the living, that a living person can project an apparition of themselves.
That is very true. In fact, I've had several really good cases where the apparition that was seen was actually a living person. And those were, to me, incredibly interesting because we were able to verify out-of-body experience at the same time so they were out of their body having some experience while people were seeing the ghost, the apparition in that sense. Most people think of apparitions of the dead. That's what people call us about. We rarely ever get called about an apparition of the living. Happens once in a while. But there are apparitions of the living, which can happen also during crisis, where they can be intentional. And, of course, we have deathbed apparitions, people who are on their deathbed seeing apparitions of their loved ones coming to take them to the other side, sometimes seen by people who are the hospice workers.
So now this other phrase you've just used, the other side, and you suggest that a ghost is a dead spirit who hasn't yet gone to the other side, is dead, but on this side. That's an interesting phrase.
That comes from mediums, but in reality, in many of our cases, we've had, whether it's a psychic or medium, or even witnesses, the people in the case, when they're not afraid anymore, and they've already had some form of interaction with the apparition. That's why they're calling to begin with. We get them past their fear. If they can then communicate with the apparition, whether it's them or a medium, we find that these apparitions that are in those places or sticking around have not moved on. They even say, I don't know what's next. I'm afraid. We have the fear factor of someone who is just deceased, who doesn't know what's next, so they don't even go there. Where I can't even say whether it's a there, an existent level of existence. Of course, mediums use the phrase "the other side" all the time. Another form of existence or plane of existence. I couldn't even tell you what that is because I haven't died, so I don't.
Well, sure.
Not in a hurry.
Certainly physical science has yet to develop any means of mapping what might exist after death. What we have to rely on are the reports of mediums and people who have experienced near-death consciousness. So there are a lot of mysteries associated with that. But I gather from reading your material that when you go in on a case investigation, you're open to using your own intuition, your own, let's call it remote viewing or impressions that may come to you while you're there. And those impressions may be of a clairvoyant nature.
Yeah, over the years, and this is probably because when I worked at the ASPR back in the early 80s.
The American Society for Psychical Research.
Psychical Research, right. I was in the education department, so I was actually an interface with the media and with the general public. But I also spent a lot of time with Carlos Osis, who was the research director, who was a long-term investigator, and Alex Tanis, who was our psychic subject. He did out-of-body research. Had also done an innumerable number of investigations with Dr. Osis and on his own. And so I was influenced by both of them in the way that Alex really made it clear to me that, yes, you can be the scientist and gather all the data from everybody else, including other psychics that you bring in, but you should also go with your gut. You should always listen to what you pick up on. And because of a couple of specific cases that I had starting in the early 90s, and there's a little bit before that, but I had a couple of cases that really kind of opened me up quite a bit more to sensing these things. And I don't blurt them out. I keep it to myself until I bring all the other data together like Dr. Osis convinced me to do. But I do pay attention to those sorts of things, and I do feel I get some clairvoyant information from time to time.
Now, earlier you mentioned the Forever Family Foundation, and I did prepare a very lengthy introduction for you with your many books and affiliations, but I didn't mention that one, so perhaps you could elaborate a little.
Sure. I am president of the Forever Family Foundation. It is a nonprofit, all-volunteer organization that supports the work of spirit mediums in the family grieving process especially, but also supports education and research in looking at survival of bodily death, life after death. So constantly putting out information from researchers. All of our conferences typically involve scientists and mediums, both sides of the coin. And I find that the mediums who have been tested and certified, because we actually have a certification process for the mediums, they are incredibly interested in the science. This is the one thing that's really impressed me, is that the mediums have been, they want to know how their stuff works. And I don't see that, over the years, I've not seen that with general psychics. I typically only see that with mediums. And I tend to think that's because mediums deal more with people than psychics do. Psychics deal with information, mediums deal with communication, living in.
Well, and so your work with the Forever Family Foundation has a lot to do with grieving individuals.
We get a lot of grieving individuals. In fact, the organization runs grief retreats a couple times a year for people with the mediums. And I've seen some really amazing turnarounds for people with some of these mediums. And we're dealing with evidential mediums who have really been tested very well.
I seem to recall on the website that there's a certification program.
Yeah, so the process was designed originally by Gary Schwartz and a few others that were involved. That was before I got involved. And every so often they'll run a certification period where they actually will run some of these mediums through a series of readings with sitters who have actually been trained to not react and to really well assess their readings after the fact, to really know whether or not it's evidential. So we're really talking evidential, which means names, dates, and places, facts, but also part of the process of mediumship that's different than psychic information generally is personality. I mean, are they coming through with descriptions of personality? Are they coming through with, he used to act like this, or his favorite saying was X, Y, and Z? Things that would never be written down anywhere, those are all important as well. And then they're also given a little background check to make sure that at least we're not dealing with somebody who's a slick fraud.
Mm-hmm. Well, historically, mediumship became a major fad in the 19th century and comparable to maybe the human potential movement today. It was a global fad, and but a lot of fraud was associated with it back then, and probably still is today to some extent.
It is. In fact, some of the mediums were called celebrity mediums. Recently, the New York Times took a bunch of them to task, and I think even John Oliver did a rant against mediums. The sad thing is that there are some really great mediums out there, and then there are some phonies, and the phonies very often are a little bit more flamboyant or looking for more fame. And so those are the ones that actually are out there in the public, and they're not the best role models. They're not the kind of people you'd normally send people to as a medium. Most of the mediums I deal with are regular people. You wouldn't know they were mediums unless they told you, or unless you saw them for a reading. You just wouldn't know that. They're average. They seem like very average, normal people.
Mm-hmm. And you have, at this point, established, I'm sure, long-term relationships with some of them.
I absolutely have, yes. With them, and also with a medium from Ireland I started working with a few years ago, who actually happens to be in California right now. Will be in New York shortly, Sandra O'Hara, and she's focused in Leslie Kean's book, Surviving Death. She's made a real impression on a lot of people. Very evident.
I have talked to various people who have in particular lost a child, which is really hard on a parent, and have gone and sought consolation from mediums, and have come back really impressed, really convinced that their child communicated to them, their deceased child communicated to them through mediums. You've had that experience as well, obviously.
I have watched that happen. The couple who started the foundation, Bob and Fran Ginsberg, had lost their daughter, and Bob was a major skeptic. Through a medium reading to one of their neighbors, their daughter Bailey, who had died in an accident, started coming through and got messages to them. And eventually Bob was totally convinced. He was tough to convince. Yeah. I've seen a lot of that. I do occasionally see at some of these meetings the one person who just cannot let go, partly because they blame themselves for the death of that child or that other loved one. And those people tend to seek out mediums again and again and again. And those are the ones that really, I think that the skeptics have always said, you shouldn't take advantage of, that the phonies are taking advantage of them. The problem is that these people, they also go to therapy. They're kind of, they're blaming themselves. They need more therapy than anything else. And I've seen mediums tell them that and tell them not to seek out other mediums, but they still do it. And there's nothing you can really do about that. The mediums will never see them again because they have recognized that this is a person is never going to let go unless they seek therapy. But nothing we can do about those individuals, unfortunately.
Now, I have read in spiritual publications that consulting with mediums and even trying to communicate with a deceased loved one is a bad idea because it kind of keeps them attached to the earth. It prevents them from moving on to whatever spiritual evolution might be most appropriate for them. Have you heard it the same?
I've heard that over the years. It's more about hearing more that the ghosts or the apparitions stick around for their loved ones rather than the ones who project back from the other side. And what I've seen in these mediumistic readings is very fascinating, actually. And the mediums will often explain this, that yes, you can want to talk to your late father, but maybe he doesn't want to talk to you. So your mother comes through, and I've seen in some of these situations where the medium will start delivering a message, and the person will say, well, that's my mother. I don't want to talk to her. I want to talk to my father. And the medium will have to say, well, your father doesn't want to talk to you. Right? Or he's not around, or he's not coming through. Your mother has something. I don't want to talk to my mother. It's like, well, sorry, we can't do anything about that. The mediums have to make it clear that while the sitter might be putting the word out for who they want to talk to, it's really up to them. All the mediums I've talked to say it's always up to the folks on the other side whether they actually want to come through or can come through at the time or are busy. They might be busy somewhere.
Probably the most famous case of a deceased child coming through goes back to the World War I period when Sir Oliver Lodge lost his son Raymond, who was a soldier, a British soldier, and Raymond began coming through various mediums. Oliver Lodge is one of the greatest scientists in British history. He co-invented the radio with Marconi, was the president of the British Scientific Society, and he published a whole book detailing many communications that he considered evidential that came from his own son.
Yeah, and interesting, of course, that book is available on the Internet Archive for people to download for free these days. It's a fascinating book. I'm lucky enough to have a copy of that. Lodge wrote some really interesting stuff. He was a really good scientist. Of course, the skeptics today say, well, scientists are really easy to fool. And the people who are saying it are scientists, which is always interesting to me.
Well, you are an accredited magician. You've been active in the field of magic. And of course, the amazing Randy, the magician, is probably most famous for promoting the idea that all magicians know that parapsychologists are easily fooled. But I'm under the impression from you that that's not the case at all.
It is not the case at all. There are certain magicians, certainly, who follow Randy. There are even some mentalists. I'm a former president of the Psychic Entertainers Association, which is an international organization of mentalists. And a good percentage of those folks believe that psychic ability is real. They have differing ideas of how much that is. And then there are some who are very skeptical. Generally, our folks don't follow Randy at all because they know a bit too much about him and his behavior. Randy, I've had run-ins with over the years, and he misrepresents our field quite a bit. In fact, most of the skeptics misrepresent our field, although many of them misrepresent it because they don't bother to read anything. And they fully admit that they don't read anything in the field. Their feeling is, why would they? So Randy's whole thrust of, if you can duplicate it by magic, it must not be real, is countered by Hollywood, which duplicates reality regularly, and even before CGI, constantly. So that doesn't invalidate reality. Mm-hmm. And you really can't invalidate something because you can duplicate it in a special effects sort of way. And I know many magicians who have had psychic experiences while on stage during their acts. And that can be very scary for them. In fact, there was a story about one magician who actually had something happen on stage. When he clearly saw the effect was broken, it still worked. And he never performed that effect again because it freaked him out so much.
Well, would you say that a knowledge of magic is helpful for people engaged in paranormal case investigations?
It is, but a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I've even seen this with our colleagues over the years. The one thing I learned in magic when I really got into it and then switched over and learned more about mentalism. First of all, magicians do not know a lot about mentalists and mentalism. We have our own literature that is kept away from the main magic community. So there's a huge portion of information that if you just go into magic, you're not going to actually understand or be able to kind of sift through. And which a lot of it, which involves psychology. We deal with more of the psychology of the audience than anything else in reading people. The big problem, and this is something that Randy has never once mentioned, he has always said pretty much that he can't be fooled, or at least put out that impression that he can't be fooled. Every magician can be fooled. That's very clear. You go to a magic convention, even the best professionals, someone comes out with a new effect, they perform the effect, people rush up to buy the effect. Most of them have no idea how the effect was done. And that's why they're buying it. Some of them are buying it to perform it. Some are buying it because they want the secret. And that includes top professionals. So if you start learning magic, but understand that you may not be able to figure it out because you don't have enough, there's something new, or there's a different way, then you're okay. You're better off with that. I mean, I know that I don't know everything. But I've seen really interesting demonstrations by magicians. I have a friend of mine who was a sleight of hand expert who loved to fake out magicians. His goal was to do card tricks that magicians could not figure out, that they thought were a different method. And I saw him do it at the Magic Castle to some magicians. So it's always really interesting, the psychology behind it.
People like Randy who would suggest that every experiment, every case field investigation should have a magician on staff. You're saying that's not the way to do it.
No. First of all, having a magician on a field investigation will only help if that magician understands the role of perception in reality, not just the role of perception when it comes to cups and balls and card tricks. You have to actually understand how the psychology of perception and the psychology of deception. And most magicians are not understanding of why something fools someone else. They can do it, and they know that it fools the senses, but not why it fools the senses. So that's an important factor, and it doesn't have to be a performing magician, although I will tell you that in my experience, having performed before an audience works wonders in understanding how people perceive things if you keep doing that compared to just reading the material or learning tricks.
I think I'm hearing you say that your background in magic does help you when you...
Yeah, it's helped me in understanding how people misunderstand things, how they confuse them.
To what extent, in the many case investigations that you've been involved in, is fraud a problem?
Such a small percentage. I'd say probably significantly less than 1%. And I will have to tell you that the fraud was not attempted or geared to, or aimed at the investigators. The fraud was generally aimed at other members of the family. I can think of only one case that I was brought in on for television that Carrie Gaynor, my fellow investigator, did for Sightings. Only one case, which was deliberate fraud to the media or attempted at the media. That's the only, I can just think of one. I have gotten calls over the years where I was very suspicious. There were some that I was pretty well convinced probably were going to be attempts at fraud, partly because they were giving me a line about, well, we have all this stuff going on. We're really scared. And then, do you think we can turn this into a TV movie? Can you bring TV people with you? It's like there's this request that they want to. So I'm pretty sure that that's happened. And actually, there have been 2 occasions in the 80s and one in the 90s where someone calling me, I was so suspicious that it was actually one of the skeptics that I called a buddy of mine who was one of the Bay Area skeptics, and he looked into it, and it was a skeptic trying to fake me out.
Yeah. Right. I think that probably happens. Skeptics committing fraud in order to prove that they can fool researchers or fool gullible believers of the paranormal is probably a bigger problem than people committing fraud for financial reasons.
Yeah, I've avoided all the ones where people think they want to sell a movie or something, but I've had some really significant cases where a family member was faking out the other family members for very psychological reasons. And that happens. But I also want to say that even in the best cases I've had, if you take the 30 things that they report as having to do with the ghost or poltergeist, and you start parsing them out, because we look at every individual incident, not just the overall situation, that a good percentage of the individual incidents are actually normal occurrences or clumsiness or something else that's been labeled as related to the paranormal because they got so freaked out to begin with that now they're just grouping everything. They're looking for something to label that way. Well, that's not fraud. It's just human nature.
On the other hand, there are some really extreme cases that have been reported. I know, for example, the Enfield poltergeist written up by Guy Lyon Playfair, the late Guy Lyon Playfair, who was a superb investigator, included just about everything you could imagine. Voices coming out of nowhere, levitations, objects being thrown around the room, people actually levitating. Have you found extreme cases like that in your own investigations?
I have not had extreme poltergeist cases like that. I've certainly seen things move, actually. We've had some cases with breaking objects and flying objects, although rarely do we get to see that happen. But nothing quite that extreme. However, I did have a case years ago when we had our graduate program at JFK University where a woman claimed she was being choked by an entity, by this shadowy figure. And she had an attack right in front of me and Sharon Salfin, Jerry Salfin's wife, now Sharon Frankmont, after they got divorced. Sharon being an amazing psychologist and psychic, so who picked up zero. She picked up nothing. But this woman fell on the ground. I actually, because of the circumstances, saw that this was about to happen. I guess my intuition had the spooky music playing in my head right before it started. And she fell on the ground. I caught her before she hit the ground. Her hands never touched her throat. Her throat bulged out like a bullfrog's. 4 depressions formed on one side, 1 on the other. And then she squeaked out, "Get it off me." So I yelled at it, whatever it was, and it stopped, which frankly amazed me. Sharon picked up nothing. We then, as we were finishing because we had just gotten started with our interview with her, as we're finishing our interview after the fact, after she calmed down, it was purely psychological. It was related to recovered memories of her father molesting her as a child and the fact that she was going to see a therapist. In fact, the attack started right after the first time she went to a therapist and talk about her father that way. So she was pretty much trying to shut herself up because she was embarrassed and guilty. So we see things like that, which are, to me, very extreme. I mean, this woman thought it was a shadowy entity. She could have easily called it a demon or something else. And we get those kinds of impressions from folks as well.
Well, in other words, the demon in this case was a memory of having been sexually abused as a child.
The therapist, we were able to rope in with the therapist, and she thought it was because she felt so guilty about talking about her father doing this that part of her was trying to prevent her from talking about it. Mm. That's hence the throat piece, the speech box. But it's kind of a monster from the id.
That's a wonderful phrase. Yes, Forbidden Planet.
Yeah, which to me is one of the best Poltergeist movies ever. Mm-hmm.
I have to say it's one of the best movies ever, as far as I'm concerned, of all time. I would say it's a fabulous script. Of course, it came out. I was like an 8-year-old kid when I saw it. Yeah. I saw it for the first time in the early '60s, and I've seen it dozens of times since then. Yeah. Yeah, it's a wonderful movie. Well, more than wonderful, it's an important movie, especially for people looking at the paranormal. Let me shift gears with you a little, if I may. I believe you make a distinction, and it's a useful one, between a ghost and a haunting. An apparition or a ghost and a haunting. And this is, there's an issue that happens. People, the typical ghost story, the Scottish lord of the manor who died in some really weird way. He's on the parapet of the castle every night at midnight, and he plays the bagpipes. It plays this like haunting refrain, and it's every night of the full moon or every night it happens. So if you were to go to the top of the castle, the parapet, and wait for that lord of the manor, and you saw him and he came towards you, what most people find in these circumstances that seem to be over and over again repetitive is that they truly are repetitive. There's no interaction. So that lord of the manor walks towards you, he walks right through you when you try to talk to him, because you're talking to a recording, some snippet of the past, and that he recorded that. In other words, that was recorded about him somehow in the environment when he was alive, not after he died. Now, if he stops and asks if you had any requests, that would make him a conscious entity or an apparition. So we have to make the distinction in all cases that figure that someone has seen, or the voices they're hearing, or the footsteps they've been hearing, have an interactive capacity to them, that there is someone home in that piece. Otherwise, we're dealing with basically a hologram. And the thing we know is that these recordings or place memories get recorded when people are alive, even if they have since passed on. I mean, we watch old movies all the time. Forbidden Planet is a good example. Many of the people in Forbidden Planet are dead. Walter Pidgeon certainly is. But we still see them. They were made when they were alive. And that's the case with these particular hauntings. Not all psychics can make that distinction, which is interesting too. Well, so what you're saying is that certain objects or locations are capable somehow of storing memories or mental impressions that from events that took place at those particular locations, and that's what results in what we call a haunting.
Yeah, that seems to be the case, which is why, you'll see ghost hunters running around with EMF meters, electromagnetic field meters. Back in the early 80s, and even slightly before that, Michael Persinger up at Laurentian University, along with Stan Krippner and Charlie Tart and others, published work around the connection between the Earth's magnetic field and psychic experience. And he started playing with artificially mimicking the Earth's magnetic field shifts and causing effects in people's brains, basically causing them to see hallucinations. So a couple of us, and it was myself and actually Andrew Nichols, who's a psychologist down in Florida, coincidentally, I didn't know him at the time, we had found that there was a handheld, inexpensive EMF meter, and we thought, let's try it in these cases where things are reported and see if we get any correlations just on a more general EMF band. The devices are actually designed for technology, so I've actually turned off the power in some houses for a time just to make sure we're not getting any wiring issues or things. And actually both of us have found, others have found this since then, that with hauntings, the spots that people report the supposed recordings, the activity in, seem to have a slightly higher than background magnetic field. And not just from the level of what technology puts out, but I actually have a couple of other devices that have also picked that up. And Bill Roll had found that with geomagnetic fields also, unusual experiences there. With apparitions, we typically don't get that. Sometimes we get unusual readings, and sometimes we don't. It seems to depend on the apparition, whether they want to affect it or something else is going on. So there's something in the environment on a physical nature that physically impinges on the environment from activity, from human interaction when we're alive, that either our brains or our consciousness or both are capable of perceiving and kind of playing back.
So are you suggesting that increased geomagnetic anomalies are associated with psychic phenomenon? Is that what you're saying?
That seems to be the case in general. There are some geomagnetic hotspots. I know of one that's been investigated by a few people down in LA, where it's a very bad hotspot. I also say that it's also probably connected to some people having illness. Some people who have actually investigated this house have gotten violently ill in the place, and they have it has a measurable, very high geomagnetic field. So it's a natural field. We have a place here outside of San Francisco. It's a house that the folks had called me about it, and we measured a high geomagnetic field. Again, nothing paranormal about that, but it caused their son to have significant psychic experiences, which continue outside the house, in fact.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, what's also interesting in this place here in the Bay Area is that the whole area, the neighborhood, which is in the middle of vineyards, by the way. It's in a town that has a low crime rate. It's in the middle of vineyards. This one little neighborhood, suburban neighborhood, has had like a 50% divorce rate, has had a couple of suicides and even a murder on the block in this middle class area. And it seems to be, maybe it's connected to the geomagnetic field. What I'm getting from people's reports is that they get agitated more easily when they're home. It may be that the geomagnetic field is acting like nails on a blackboard in their unconscious and kind of keeping them on edge.
Yeah, because my general impression from that old research is that a decrease in the intensity of the geomagnetic field is associated with psychic receptivity, not an increase.
The increase, from what Persinger's research showed, it seemed like the general trend was the decrease was more activity on the clairvoyant and telepathic range, and an increase was more psychokinetic and possibly precognitive, although Scott Rogo had some issues with that as well. But I think also the increase influences people's emotional state, and that can have an impact.
Mm-hmm. So when you go out on a case, there are many, many factors that you're paying attention to. The magnetic fields, the psychological environment of the individuals involved, the possibilities for deception and or illusions that might fool the senses. Yeah.
We're looking at everything. I mean, really, the goal for most, I will be honest, the goal for most investigations that we do is not necessarily to follow the scientific method, because the goal in most calls that we get is, can we help the people? Mm-hmm. And by the way, that would include possibly the apparition if, because that ghosts are people too, of course. But we do try to help the people, and that means understanding what looks like it's going on, how much is not paranormal, where the phenomena falls into our categories, and what we can actually help them do about it. But we're using every tool we possibly can. I am using EMF quite a bit, but a lot of times with apparition cases and poltergeist cases, we get zero changes in the electromagnetic fields in the area. So that may be telling for a haunting for that imprint, but it's not very helpful in other areas.
Mm-hmm. You have indicated to me that there's a growing industry of manufacturers supplying technological products or quasi-technological products to this new army of ghost hunters.
Yeah, I'm kind of sorry because I did see that starting up back in the late 1990s. I'm kind of sorry that I didn't rope all our colleagues in, would create our company. We could have made a fortune off of these people because some people are doing that. They are making devices that don't do what they say they do. In fact, they don't even provide the specs for a lot of these things. But as long as they're labeled ghost this or spirit box that, people will buy into it. There's a couple people who have designed devices using the Kinect, the Xbox Kinect motion sensor, which uses LiDAR and infrared. And they create stick figures, and nobody seems to know what it's picking up, actually, that to create these stick figures on the visual display, on the pad, the tablet. Nor will the guy who's designed this let anybody look into it to find out if there's anything significant going on inside. I've seen some of these randomizers, the things that scan the radio frequencies. Are they truly random? You know this, that in our laboratory studies, we have to constantly look at our random number generators, random devices, to make sure they're staying random. So is there something else going on? There are just so many questions we have about the technology that it just doesn't hold up. Not to mention the fact that no technology currently, as far as we know, can be designed to detect the paranormal because we don't know what we're trying to detect.
I mean, there are any number of technologies you could bring to bear just to see what might happen.
And in fact, I would love to have a full spectrum of environmental sensors in a room. I mean, for years, I've worked with TV producers on and off to help design a TV show. We never get to sell it because the networks always want the same old stuff. They want people running scared. Mm-hmm. But the idea of having environmental sensors in a house where things have been going on, just let them sit there while we're not even there, but the family is there, and let it pick up whatever it picks up, and then correlate that to the people's experiences would be very telling.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned earlier that most of the amateurs going into the field of ghost hunting do it because they hope to get a TV show.
I don't know if most of them do it. I think a lot of them do it because they have a curiosity about this. Maybe they even had experience. But they go in knowing that if plumbers can do it, because that's what the guys from Ghost Hunters were, if plumbers can do it with a few things off the shelf, then we can do it too. And that's the one thing the shows did, is they really showed that the average person, you don't need to have education to go and do ghost hunting. But that's also the danger, because that means that you're going in following methods or protocols that are established by a TV show. And actually, even the guys who are doing the show, the folks who are doing the show, have had to alter what they're doing based on what the producers want them to do. So they're downplaying education to a point where people have said in and around the paranormal community, as it's called these days, nobody's an expert. You can't learn this stuff. We shouldn't listen to anybody who claims to be an expert. Well, that's so not true. You can teach the investigation methods. You can even teach people to be psychic. I mean, all that's been well established in our field.
Mm-hmm. Now, but you also happen to be very knowledgeable about the media, not only because you've been on umpteen programs, but because your father was a media executive, as I recall.
That's correct. My dad actually started out as a stage manager and worked his way up eventually to a producer. He was with NBC Sports, actually produced the 72 Olympics, the game of the week all the time, and then he was a vice president of programming at NBC. When he left NBC, he handled the international broadcast of both the Tournament of Roses parade and the Rose Bowl for many years, as well as other things. Plus, my uncle, his brother, was a soap opera director. and on the Directors Guild board. And I had an uncle, my mother's brother, who just passed away, was a newscaster for WMCA radio in New York, and a skeptic. So it was interesting growing up with him. Both my brothers are in the media. I have a couple cousins who are in the media. So I grew up at 30 Rock.
So you have a deep understanding of the divergent interests of the media to provide entertainment on the one hand, and of the parapsychology and psychical research community who are either engaging in these projects, as you point out, to help people who are troubled, or to do it in order to increase our knowledge.
It's true. And it's really been very helpful to me to deal with the media this way. I will say that I've made several of the directors and producers uncomfortable over the years when I've mentioned my dad or my uncle. And I am kind of trying to put them off guard, because I want to make sure that they understand that I understand what they're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, entertainment, if your goal is purely to entertain people, you're going to look for the most extreme examples. You want to titillate your viewers. Sometimes the actual research can be very boring. I mean, you may have to sit around for hours and hours with nothing happening at all.
Yeah, and that's something we have to explain. Obviously, it's why the TV shows we see that are paranormal tend to, and number one, work in the dark, because it's spookier. They use all this technology because it can show something, even if it's not real. And I have to constantly point out that these are not documentaries, and even documentaries can be geared in a certain way. They're supposed to be for entertainment.
Yeah. And so naturally, there's a tendency to make claims that are well beyond what anyone in the scientific community might wish to claim about these things. But on the other hand, I have the impression from you that when it comes to the question of survival of the human being, post-mortem survival, you seem to be pretty clear in your own understanding. For example, when you said ghosts are people too, that you accept survival.
I do accept survival. I will tell you honestly that I wasn't sure about it when I got into the field. It took a few years, and it really was a couple of cases that I had starting around 1984 and 85 that I just could not accept that it could be some form of superior ESP happening at the time. Too many witnesses, too much information, just too many things that indicated personality. And over the years, since that time, I've had experiences of my own. Never seen a ghost, never seen an apparition, but I have had the experience in one case of kind of constantly feeling a presence and actually being walked through, while some psychics who just came into the room saw that actually happening and described that. So I've had those personal experiences which really kind of cemented it. But looking at the evidence since the mid 80s, when I really started looking into the literature and to the experiences people had and the patterns, there just seemed to be clear support that something is going on. There is some consciousness after death happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, another important part of the work that you do, since you're working with so many mediums and you will bring intuitives and psychics in on cases, is how you relate to these people.
Well, I did an assessment of psychics and mediums in a couple of cases for a conference that the Parapsychology Foundation put on a few years ago on mediums, actually. And it was really interesting. I came up with a checklist of the best mediums the best mediums and psychics, besides having accurate information. The reality is, and you recall our colleague Marcello Truzzi, who was a middle-of-the-road skeptic. He was one of my mentors. He worked with psychics who work with police, even though he didn't believe in psychic ability. And he felt that some people just were perceptive enough to see things differently, and as long as they were useful. So putting aside the usefulness, because the usefulness is important, whether they're psychic or not, that's important. I found that the better psychics and mediums had, number one, a really good sense of humor about themselves, that they didn't take themselves, this is me too, I don't take myself seriously. I like to play a little bit. And the best mediums and psychics are normal people who have a great sense of humor, They can take a hit if somebody starts making fun of them, for example. They can do that. They also have a little bit of ego, but that ego is more of a performer ego and not a diva type ego. We don't ever work with people who decide that they have to be the center of attention. They also are really good people. In other words, they can interact with people very well. So I have found people who are not only good and useful in terms of their information, but I kind of feel them out for their personality. And if they're not a team player, if they're not interested, and they have to have a curiosity about the phenomena and a curiosity about what we're doing, and they just can't dictate what's going on. So there's a lot of them out there. And clearly what's happening with Forever Family Foundation, we found an awful lot or attracted an awful lot of those people too.
Mm-hmm. For the many viewers out there who may consider themselves ghost hunters and are sincerely interested in developing professional or more professional skills, what would you recommend?
Well, first thing I would say is forget looking on the internet too much. Read actual books by people in the field and around the field of parapsychology and psychical research. I have a couple of books out, of course, but there's people whose names are very important, like Scott Rogo and William Roll are two examples. Steve Parsons, who has published something just recently with the Society for Psychical Research, a guidance notes booklet, has written a great book taking apart the technology that ghost hunters deal with. Cal Cooper is another one who's been involved in that. So look to the SPR and look to the Parapsychological Association and the Rhine Research Center. We have our own courses now on parapsychology that we offer online through the Rhine Education Center. Those are places to go to find who the people are who really know what to teach you.
Mm-hmm. Well, Loyd Auerbach, this has been an informative and delightful conversation. You've been engaged in really fascinating activities for many, many decades, and I'm looking forward to additional conversations with you.
Same here, Jeffrey.
Thank you so much, Loyd.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org